Is this working? It is. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good evening. I am Judith Rose, Deputy Cultural Counselor of the French Embassy and Deputy Director of Villa Albertine. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the first in-person New York appearance of Olivier Guez on the occasion of the publication by Verso of the English translation of his novel, The Disappearance of Josef Mengele, translated by Georgia de Chambéry. Olivier Guez is the last writer we will host this year as part of our Authors on Tour program. After participating in many events in Boston, Chicago, and Princeton, he is finishing his tour in New York. He will be joined in conversation with Pulitzer Prize winner Joshua Cohen, who is doing us the great honor of leading the conversation this evening. Thank you both very much for being with us tonight for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. Now, a very brief word of introduction about the two of you. Olivier Guez is the author of novels and essays translated into more than 30 languages, including American Spleen, L'Impossible Retour, which is a history of Jews in Germany since 1945, Éloge de l'Esquive, and Les Révolutions de Jacques Coscas. His Disappearance of Josef Mengele, released this year by Verso, was the recipient of the 2017 Prix Renaudot in France. It has been adapted in graphic novel format and is currently being adapted for the screen. As a journalist, Olivier Guez has contributed to Le Monde, Le Point, the New York Times, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and the Corriere della Sera. Joshua Cohen was born in 1980 in Atlantic City. His many books include the novels Wits, Moving Kings, Book of Numbers, as well as the short fiction collection Four New Messages and the non-fiction collection Attention, Dispatches from a Land of Distraction. Joshua Cohen was awarded Israel's 2013 Matanel Prize for Jewish Writers, and in 2017 was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. He won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for his novel, The Netanyahus. And as you will soon find out, those two have a lot in common, or at least a lot to talk about together. So I want to wish all of you a wonderful evening. And Joshua, Olivier, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are these on? They're on. Hello. It's a real honor to be here. I like this as the first in-person event, but you're the last writer. It's, you know, it's good.
Yeah, you have to enjoy it. I'm the last writer who comes to New York.
And thank you for everyone for coming out. You know, to an evening of Josef Mengele. I'll just begin by saying that the time before, the last time I'd thought about Mengele was when a friend in common, Joachim Schnurf, a writer and an editor in France, you know, texts me and he says, "You got to read this thing about Mengele," and which is this book. And the time before that, which was not much more before that, I was in Israel, and a writer friend of mine said to me, "You need to read this crazy thing that this rabbi was putting together." And this guy had finally come up with, it was sort of a very late, because rabbis take a long time to do things, it was a rabbinic response to vaccination. And he was wondering about these changes made to our mRNA with these vaccines. And he says that, you know, this is the end of the Jewish people as Jews, because the DNA has been changed for the first time in Jewish history, and never has anything been done to the Jewish people since Mengele. And, you know, this was a guy whose yeshiva was closed for months because, you know, but, and the idea of Mengele being this shorthand for race science, for the ultimate violation, which is the violation of the body, is something that endures. So I want to begin by asking Olivier why Mengele, and not just why Mengele, but also why specifically the end of Mengele.
Hi, good evening. I'm very happy to be in New York here. This is the end of my US tour, and very happy to be in Albertine with you, Josh, and all of you. Why Mengele? I've been speaking about this book for something like 5 years, and it's always the first question, why Mengele? And actually I ask myself this question many times before all of you. This book about Mengele, which is a book about the second part of the life of Mengele, the second life of Mengele after Auschwitz, when he arrives in South America in 1949 till his death in 1979 in Brazil. This is the last part, the third part of a trilogy about post-war Europe, post-war Germany, somehow post-war South America. It started something like nearly 20 years ago when I moved to Berlin in 2005 to write this book about the story of the Jews in Germany after the war. And with this book, I wanted to understand why Jews decided to stay or to come back or just to move to Germany. And it functioned as a mosaic. It's like, it's more an essay, it's not a novel like this one. And it's also a book about the relationship of the Germans to their memories. And of course, it changes a lot from the 1950s till the 70s, the 90s, and so on, in the two Germanys and then the reunited Germany. But this is a book from a victim perspective, the Jews and Germany, the Jews and the land of the murderers. But at that time, I already had in mind the idea to write the same story, but from a murderer perspective. But I didn't know which one, which criminal to select. And in between, there is a movie. When the book was translated, the book about the story of the Jews in Germany was translated into German, a film director came to me and proposed me to write a script, and we wrote a script about this famous German prosecutor called Fritz Bauer. Fritz Bauer is very well known because he organized the biggest trial in Western German history called the Auschwitz process, the Auschwitz trial, which took place in Frankfurt in the mid-60s. And so Bauer is known for this, but what people didn't know till not very long is that Bauer, in fact, found Eichmann in Argentina. He's the one who gave the tip to the Mossad. And actually, it was a bargain between Bauer and the Mossad. I give you Eichmann, but you give me back Eichmann to organize a trial. And as we know, the trial took place in Jerusalem. But to prepare the scripts, I read a lot about Argentina, of course, and all this Nazi cycle in Buenos Aires in the 50s, at the time of Peron. And through Eichmann, I met Mengele many times. And I said, okay, this is the one I want. He is the one, because of course, it has this terrible reputation. It's like a signature of the Holocaust. When you say Mengele, you immediately think at the worst what happened in Europe in the mid-40s. And also there were lots of mysteries about Mengele. I mean, Mengele became a kind of a figure of pop culture in the 60s because of this process, because of the trial in Frankfurt I mentioned, because of the trial of Eichmann, but he was the one who always vanished. No one had any idea where he was, so there was all this mystery. So lots of crap things, I would say, were written about Mengele. I always quote Simon Wiesenthal, and I mean, Wiesenthal played a very important role because he reminded the whole world who Mengele was, but he had no idea where he was. So he presented Mengele in a 1967 book like a villain in James Bond, a kind of Dr. No or Goldfinger. He lives in Asunción and he drives a big Mercedes, black Mercedes, and he's surrounded by beautiful women, and he lives in Estancia, a typical 60s imagination kind of pop culture figure. Then there were all these movies in the 70s. I mean, two of them are very famous. The first one is The Boys from Brazil with Gregory Peck. And this is even crazier somehow because Mengele lives in the south of Brazil and he produces twins in a little city, and he also produces little Hitlers. So this kind of imagination. And I think the most famous one is, of course, Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman. And Laurence Olivier, who plays the sadist, is a kind of adaptation of the idea of what people had in mind when they thought about Mengele at the time. So there were all these mysteries, all this reputation, and most of it was completely false. So I wanted to, it's like the first level, I would say, of this book is it's an investigation. Who helped Mengele? Who was he exactly? What happened to him? What did the Mossad? What did the CIA? What did the Germans? And so on. And the second aspect of the book, why Mengele, I mean, everybody knows that he was never caught, he was never put on trial, but did life punish him somehow? Was it a punishment? This is a kind of crime and punishment issue about Mengele that I wanted to dig. So to your questions, why Mengele, this is my answer, I would say, to start with.
Maybe then I'll read a little, because there's this section that I was hoping to read from this kind of speaks directly to that answer. So this is fairly deep into the book. I should also say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a novel because the historical record is so spotty, and but the amount of research that goes into this is astounding. And let me begin with just this little section. Traveling under the protection of a Praetorian Guard of Indians in March 1961, Mengele is identified in the small town of Mato Grosso, but manages to escape the ambush plotted by the Brazilian police. Some months later, he is reported arrested in the state of Minas Gerais in southeastern Brazil. This turns out to be an unfortunate mistake. The man detained is identified as an ex-Waffen-SS member on holiday. Mengele is spotted once again in February 1962, this time in a town on the border with Paraguay. His hotel is stormed by an elite military police unit, but he left that very morning. The Argentine press announces that he murdered a Mossad agent in Bariloche. Armed and extremely dangerous, he has a private army in his pay, which accompanies him wherever he goes. Since a reward has been put on his head and the nature of his crimes fully revealed, Mengele becomes a subject of fantasy and conjecture. He is becoming a mythical creature, quote, the diabolical doctor, Satan's henchman, not comparable to a man despite his appearance, playwright Rolf Huchut writes in The Deputy, a Christian tragedy in 1963. Mossad is not sidetracked by the wild rumors. The special unit has its headquarters in Paris, headed by Zvi Aharoni, a German Jew instrumental in the kidnapping of Eichmann, who swears he will drag his compatriot before an Israeli court. He has accurate information and has identified two of Mengele's contacts in South America, Krug and Rudel, but the hunt is complex. The family and its entourage in Günzburg are impenetrable, and Krug's family is suspicious. One of the girls resists the playboy allure of the special unit agent sent to charm her. Aharoni deploys several more agents in Paraguay, convinced that Mengele has returned there. The Israelis have got wind of his naturalization. Rudel is tailed all over South America, and Martha's mail is intercepted. Aharoni tries to infiltrate the German community's institutions in Asunción. Mossad is turning up the heat, but not yet to boiling point. Mengele is still one step ahead. That is until spring of 1962. In Uruguay, Aharoni has hunted down some big game with the sort of deeply personal knowledge spy masters can only dream of. Sasson comes forward prepared to introduce his old friend Mengele, ostensibly because he has sullied the honor of the SS, but principally because Sasson needs money to support his glitzy, luxurious lifestyle and all his mistresses. Mossad greases his palm handsomely. The Dutch adventurer has lost track of Mengele, but soon finds out that he has fled to Brazil and identifies his new protector, Wolfgang Gerhard, the fugitive's only contact with the outside world. The Mossad agents do not let go of Gerhard, and one morning the Austrians' Ford Anglia takes off into the savannah, bound for an isolated farm. Aharoni goes for a picnic in the vicinity of the farm with two agents who are Brazilian Jews. 3 men come to meet them. One of them is of medium build and looks European. He has a mustache and a hat pressed down firmly over his eyes. He keeps quiet and stands back while his 2 beefy companions speak Portuguese with the 3 walkers. Aharoni lets his men do the talking while he observes the man in the hat, who avoids his gaze. it's him. He'd bet his life on it. God, he would love to get his hands around that throat and crush the life out of it, but he keeps his cool. Another unit must come to take photos of the man to make certain. Just a few weeks more. The worst thing would be to arouse the suspicions of the suspect. The three men return to the farm, and Aharonah goes back to his Parisian headquarters, where he begins work on an operation even trickier than Eichmann's kidnapping. I wanted to sort of continue on from that first question and really ask something that is at the heart of the book, and it really an interesting puzzle. This idea of these, I think you call them ratlines, right? The idea that Peron pursues and has all of these ties with, the Peron government has all these ties with these organizations that smuggle and hide Nazis. And it's hard to understand that the benefit of taking in these pretty broken men, you know, would outweigh the downsides, and yet he does this, and not just him, but I mean, you know, he being the metonym for his regime. Why, and what itch did that scratch for him?
I mean, Peronism is more or less impossible to understand. I mean, still today, and Argentinians keep trying to understand what is Peronism. But Peron had a kind of a clear vision at the end of the Second World War. Peron was at the Argentinian embassy in Rome at the beginning of the war, and was very impressed by the fascist regime, more than the Nazi regime. And of course, I mean, there are so many connections between Italy and Argentina. And Peron considered the Axis powers, I mean Germany, Italy, and Japan, as a kind of a third force, a first non-aligned movement between the Western democracies, capitalist democracies like the US, England, France, of course, and the communist bloc, I mean, around the Soviet Union. And he thought that after the defeat of this Axis, Argentina could lead this third force. Especially because you have to remember, I mean, in the late 40s, early 50s, lots of people thought that the US and the Soviet Union would destroy themselves through nuclear bombs. And basically, Argentina had a great luck to be extremely far from the Soviet Union and from the US. But Argentina was not developed enough, so they needed scientists, they needed doctors, they needed specialists in chemistry, and so on, and ballistic, and this takes a long time, I mean, for the formation of these people. So basically, did this market in Germany. I mean, you had thousands of engineers, thousands of doctors who wanted to have a new life, who wanted to leave Europe. So they were very welcomed in Argentina. And this seems also strange, but since the late 40s, especially the beginning of the 50s, these people were not searched. We were in a Cold War perspective. That was the most important thing. And the Germans were useful for everybody. I mean, in the US, you all know that von Braun helped so much, I mean, the special program of the US. And so many people made more or less their market. And because Argentina was less powerful than the US, they didn't get the best. But that's why so many people, in fact, came to Argentina, and it was not a big risk. First, because now, of course, we know the end of the story, but in the late 40s, early 50s, no one knew what would happen in Germany. I mean, all these people, first, they were very young men, so they went to Argentina or to other South American countries, but they didn't know if they would last. They knew that they had to live for a certain while. But lots of them thought that a kind of a new fascist power would come back in Germany. I mean, democracy was not written. The development that we know was not written. So it was not a big risk, and it was a challenge for all of them. I mean, for the Argentinians and for the Europeans, especially the Germans who came to Argentina at the time.
And in your portrayal of Mengele, or actually of that entire milieu, you have, and it tends to be the case with all books, not just novels, but nonfiction books as well, where you have these, let's say, these names that are so famous almost to become emptied out of meaning or impossible to understand, they tend to resolve themselves in these dialectical ways. And so in your novel, you have these two figures. You have Eichmann on one side, and you have Mengele on the other. And it's a moment of true humor in the book when they are introduced. The guy who introduces them, they're living under many different names, but the guy can't hold himself back, and he's like, okay, that's really Eichmann, that's really Mengele, you guys should meet. And the moment where Eichmann has no idea who Mengele is, right? I mean, why would he? He's a doctor at Auschwitz, and Eichmann is at the top of, the literal pile of corpses. He's at the top. But now they're in the same place. And what's interesting is that the person who would seem to have the most experience, or should have had the most experience with, what we would call tradecraft or spycraft, which would be Eichmann, right, is living flamboyantly, is trying to, is considering, memoirs of a certain kind or some way of rehabilitating himself. And because he lives so publicly, he sticks his neck out too far and he's caught. And Mengele isn't. And so I want this sort of, when you see these two figures and their two different fates, what do you see as fundamentally different about their characters? And then what do you see as fundamentally different about their Nazism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the meeting between Eichmann and Mengele is a turning point in this history. I mean, in Argentina, where they both live, they go back to their social status they were born in. Mengele is a bourgeois. He comes from a rich family who gets even richer after the war. He had 2 PhDs in medicine and anthropology. He loved classical music, German classical music, classical literature. He was a true conservative in the early 30s when he was 20. Eichmann is the opposite. He comes from a very low class, never finished school. And then he became one of the heads of he became the head of the Holocaust machine. So he knew the biggest heads of the Nazi regime. But when they arrive in Argentina, they go back to where they were before Nazism. Eichmann is the true misfit, is the true has-been. I mean, he was very big, and now in Argentina doesn't have any money, but he speaks a lot because he boasts himself that he knew all the big shots of the regime. And Mengele is the opposite. Mengele was not a big shot. Mengele was a little fish in the machine. He was one doctor among hundreds, thousands of doctors who worked in the concentration camps. He was only a captain. He was a major. Nothing special. He went to the Russian front, and then he went to Auschwitz. We'll speak maybe why he went to Auschwitz. But he's this rich kid in Buenos Aires. He has a nice life, lots of girlfriends, lots of money. He works for his family business in the whole of South America. Whereas Eichmann, every business he tries is a full collapse. It's a complete, and then they are completely different. I mean, Mengele doesn't need to speak because he doesn't have so much to say. Actually, he was just a doctor, whereas Eichmann was this big head, and they ate each other from the very beginning. And this is not fiction. I mean, when we use the word novel for this book, it's more like a narrative nonfiction. And we use novel in French to get a big prize, to be honest, in France, because novels get bigger prize in France than nonfiction. But it's a narrative nonfiction with some fiction elements. And to go back to this relationship, Eichmann is like a social phenomenon at all these Nazi parties in Buenos Aires. He speaks about what he did, we met, with whom he slept, from Heydrich, of Himmler, and so on. Whereas Mengele is very kind of shy, kind of quiet. He doesn't want any problems. He doesn't need this. It's very bourgeois. You don't speak so much about your status. And of course, when Eichmann is caught by the Mossad, I mean, this changes completely the life of Mengele. This is the big turning point of this story. But it's this meeting, and this is where fiction enters this narrative non-fiction, in a sense that it's kind of comic the way they meet. It could be a Mel Brooks scene somehow. And I organized, I would say, this meeting in a very famous German restaurant in Buenos Aires, ABC, which still exists. If you want a traditional German meal in Buenos Aires, I recommend to go to ABC. It hasn't changed for the last 70, 80 years. And this place was very famous for former Nazis in Buenos Aires. They used to go there and to meet, and so I decided to organize the meeting. But no one knows where they met at the first time. But it's true that this is from this, through this friend in common, Sassen, who is the dad of the famous Saskia Sassen, who was very famous in America, for instance.
So I want to lead this to, you know, what brings him to Auschwitz, but I want to lead in with, you know, we see at every recurrence of populism that where, you know, everyone who has who's a card-carrying member of the internet begins putting up, you know, Hannah Arendt quotes, you know, and then the other people who are card-carrying members of the internet put up, you know, Nazi memes, and one of the things that is discussed is, you know, what are the roots, or as Hannah Arendt would put it, what are the origins of totalitarianism? And, you know, there are a lot of these explanations that are asset seizure, right? People who come from a lower class or a self-perceived lower class or an otherly perceived lower class who are attempting to assert their will, right, over others. There is class anxiety, there's class rage, there, so on and so forth. But, and you can, I think a lot of the marquee Nazis, let's say, can very much, I think, be you know, fitted under that rubric of, you know, that is their motivation for this, and that they were significantly, they were able to dissociate enough from the actual consequences of their murder because they murdered from desks. And then you have Mengele, whose interest seems biological, it seems it seems genetic, and it seems almost entirely personally obsessional, and it seems to me of all the forms of Nazism, none of which are particularly relatable to me, it seems the least relatable, and so I wanted to kind of talk about that, because I feel like we're also dancing around things that you don't dance around in the book. What causes someone to collect a bunch of blue eyes and keep them in a suitcase? What causes someone to experiment on twins? What causes someone to have, you know, interspecies insemination experiments?
I mean, I'm not at all a specialist of the show. I never wanted to dig in too much, but of course I had to prepare that book. And I mean, to depict Mengele as a monster is too easy. Then you don't understand. I mean, he did monstrous things, but in a very rational way, I would say. Most of people, when they think about Mengele, they think about the crazy doctors, dissecting human parts or sending eyes or this kind of thing. He did this, but it was not crazy for him. Mengele was a little part of a huge chain, which was the German medicine, the German biology, the German genetics of the time. Mengele was never alone. I mean, Mengele was sent to Auschwitz by one of his professors with whom he had worked on his thesis. And it was a very rational choice. It was like a Faustian choice in the sense that, well, he could have stayed in a laboratory. I mean, he had been on the Russian front. He was tired. He had been hurt on the Russian front. And he decided to go to Auschwitz, I mean, to proceed at these experiments as an opportunist, because it was a huge opportunity, in fact, to practice experiments, not on rabbits or on rats or mice, but on human beings. So he goes there. And I didn't completely answer the second part of your last question, what kind of Nazism? And we have to go back, we always have to go back to Arendt and this idea of the banality of evil. I think Mengele is a better example than Eichmann about this idea of banality of evil. I think Arendt somehow fell in the trap that Eichmann and his defense tried to build up in Jerusalem. they wanted to show that finally at the end Eichmann was just a piece in this huge death machine. But Eichmann was at the top of this machine, whereas Mengele was not at the top. He was a little thing, a little fish, as I said. And the reasons for why Mengele goes to Auschwitz are very banal. This is opportunism, that the guy wanted to become a university professor after the war. And again, this idea of opportunism goes back to the 30s. I mean, as I said, Mengele was a true conservative, German conservative, very traditionalist. But he was not a Nazi when he was in his early 20s, in the early 30s in Germany. But as a doctor, he understood that Nazism, and we always forget this somehow, is a biopolitics. What does it mean? It means that biology, medicine, genetics are at the center of the regime, of the system. And as a young doctor, if you were ambitious, I mean, you could go very far. And that's why he decided to move to the party in 1937, and then to enter the elite corps, the SS, in 1938, but pretty late. I mean, that was 4 or 5 years after Hitler seized power in 1933. So this is pure opportunism, ambitions, and then it's thanks God, it's very difficult for us to imagine this, but first, this generation, I mean, he was born in 1911, so he's a kid of the First World War. Violence was everywhere in this society, in European society. And then he was on the Russian front. When you were on the Russian front in the early 40s, I mean, you were confronted with hundreds, thousands of bodies dead everywhere, every day. So you had this very strange relationship to life. Plus, you had, of course, the ideology of the time. What was the ideology? I mean, because everything was a matter of races. I mean, if you presented some races, especially the Jews or the Slavs or the Gypsies, but especially the Jews, as the worst race, as like a mosquito, in fact, basically you kill mosquitoes. We all kill mosquitoes. They were presented like mosquitoes. And the regime and the system, in fact, protected and encouraged people like Mengele to go that far, to go as far as he went. But when the system collapsed after 45, what can a guy like Mengele do? And this is the whole question of the book also. When you're not protected anymore, when you're not authorized to do these kind of things. And again, to go back to this question, this is very banal what he did. Of course, you need a certain psychology to go that far. And but this is a good example, in fact, how the Nazi regime or totalitarian regime work. They protect, in fact, the worst aspects of the human beings, and they encourage them somehow.
The trajectory is sort of hard to. You have to step back from the detail of the prose and from the facts of the prose to understand the trajectory. And the trajectory is, in a very broad sense, as I read it, is, you know, here's a doctor who, you know, takes a Hippocratic oath, right, and immediately, you know, sets about violating it, but in a totally self-justified way. He can explain to himself that he is helping to understand the better human and the perfectible human, and he's building himself toward, you know, building humanity toward a higher perfectibility. And after the war, he finds himself, you know, working as a carpenter, working manual labor jobs that he feels are beneath him. And then, as you track this, and in some of the most difficult parts of the book, because there is the invitation to empathy, his body breaks down on him, right? He suffers a stroke. He's taken care of by a nurse that he then tries to have a relationship with. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of coming off from your answer about biopolitics, about this idea of perfectibility, right? We're living at this edge of our ability to genetically modify large amounts of our own, you know, material. And the arguments in favor of that are very obvious. You have to kind of look at, you know, children who die, you know, immediately after birth, or who live with crippling conditions, to understand that if we can make one thing go in one direction or one thing go in the other and spare that person, then we've done good. But what is the lesson about perfectibility that we can get from Mengele, and how can we apply it as we enter what I believe to be a new phase of biopolitics that's terrifying?
I mean, the Nazis were obsessed by the bodies, by the perfect bodies, the perfectibility of the bodies, a special body, not everybody, of course. And it's interesting to note that the Nazis were the first, in fact, to ban smoking from trains or imposed gymnastics to that point. I mean, this very idea of the perfect body, of course, comes from Greece, antique Greece, but then it was, I mean, all these totalitarian movements, actually most of the nationalist movements of the first part of the 20th century were obsessed with the bodies. Even the Zionists, I mean, if you look at the first propaganda of the 20s, 30s, they were obsessed by the bodies. Of course, the Germans had a very special vision of the body. It could be just one body. I mean, this iron thing, and they had a plan, actually. So they waged this war against the Soviet Union from June 41. What was the objective? The objective was to displace first and then murder all the Jews, to enslave or get rid of most of the Slavs, of the Gypsies, and then you had these empty spaces. And the SS, all the Germans, but especially the SS, so the elite, were encouraged, in fact, to have as much kids as possible, with as many women as possible, to populate, in fact, these new spaces which would be empty after the wars. But they were not enough. So the key question was twins. The guy who would find the secrets of the twins would be the king of the new Germany and of this new world. And that's why, in fact, they did all this research. And that's why Mengele was obsessed with the twins. Again, this is opportunism. This is not something crazy that he was just obsessed by twins. There was a reason for that. And then we changed somehow our relationship to the body after the war. But it's true that in our society, we're completely obsessed by this body thing. It comes back. And it's true that, I mean, when we were kids somehow, you had these trisomic kids. But in Western society, you don't see trisomic kids anymore. This is just an example, but this is true. When in the 80s, when I was a kid, you saw other bodies. Now you're shipping. This is like a new industry. Nothing comparable, of course, with the Nazi vision. But still, this obsession with the bodies, with the sanity of the body, with the purity of the body, comes from that time. This is for sure. I remember also when I was a kid, when we used to speak about politicians in France, I mean, the most popular one were the bald ones, a bit fat. It could give confidence, I mean, to the electorate. But now it's the opposite. Just look at leaders all around the world. I mean, this a full transformation, a full transformation. And I mean, America was started before, but if you compare Kennedy to, I wouldn't say to de Gaulle, it's another generation, but Michel Debré, for instance, for people who remember Michel Debré, I mean, this is two complete worlds. I mean, this American vision of the aesthetics of the body, the perfection, came, I mean, in all the stratas of the society.
So I have, I'm going to have one more question, then we'll open it up maybe for questions from the audience. But I wanted to ask a question about the writing itself. It seems to me that there, you know, there have been at various times in the 20th century these inflection points or points of crisis with regard to the purpose of fiction or the moral fate of fiction, and the quote-unquote sanctity of facticity, the sanctity of the fact, which is almost held in as high regard for purity as the body, right? The body and the fact are two things that we do like preserving for some reason. I was wondering, in the actual practice of writing, though, right? Most writers think about what is the next necessary sentence, right? And not necessarily a particular genre. And anyone who's written nonfiction also knows that you can respect the facts while also coloring them. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about where you see the role of fiction in what you do, and storytelling, let's say, in what you do, and beyond that, working also in film and literature, what is the relationship you find kind of between the two?
For last question, it's a big question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a huge last question. I had a source of inspiration for this book. It's the book of Truman Capote, In a Cold Blood. When you read this book was written in '65, I think. And I read it before starting my research on Mengele, because I was looking for something which could be a kind of a model. Basically, when you read this book today, you understand the trajectory of the two murderers. You don't know exactly what Capote invented or what is not true, but it's not so important at the end. You understand the trajectory of these two guys. And what I wanted to do was to write the trajectory of Mengele after the war. And because we'll never know exactly. I mean, 30 years is extremely long. I mean, the guy had to hide for something like 20 years, so we don't know exactly.
And they don't even confirm his death for what, 5-6 years after.
Yeah, I mean, there were, well, now, I mean, some good, lots, I said that lots of crap that had been written about Mengele, but a few good books were also written, especially one biography by 2 American lawyers, and also some German scholar papers and so on, so there were things. But I wanted to write the trajectory of this man. And through the trajectory, I gave you the example of the ABC meeting with Eichmann in Argentina. So it's not very important, I would say. I can give you another example. So Mengele stayed 20 years in Brazil. And out of these 20 years, he stayed like something like 15 years with an Hungarian family. With the Hungarian family, then an affair with the lady of the family. This is a very important point. Otherwise, you don't understand why he stayed so long, and why the relationship was so tense, and also relationship with her. It's a death triangle. It's incredible what happened with this. But this is true. I mean, he had an affair with this lady. But no one knows exactly how long, who started, where, and so on and so on. So as a novelist, I could take the freedom, in fact, to imagine this kind of thing, but respecting the history. Because when, I mean, there is the name of Josef Mengele in the title, so basically I have to respect the facts. Otherwise, I would have written The Disappearance of Josef Schmidt, a true fiction. So this is the real story of Mengele, but with the things, the details that we'll never know, that I took the liberty, in fact, to fill the void. But for some historians, because there are some novels, especially in France, we love these kind of things. But maybe because we are too lazy to write proper biographies, so we kind of, I don't know, we mix it somehow. I don't know, but it's a true genre in France. It's a bit different in the US, for instance. You still have these huge biographies.
I mean, the only people who are allowed to do it in the US are French writers.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes. So we enjoy this this privilege. And but for instance, in Germany, I mean, I had a very long tour in Germany. I went to 60 cities. There were lots of articles. But for some Germans, especially from German professors, history professors, I mean, to write about the sex life of Mengele in Argentina was something impossible. And I remember, there's this newspaper called Die Zeit. They have huge pages in Die Zeit. And they publish, of course, a review of the book. And I knew the historian. I didn't know her personally, but she wrote an amazing book about Eichmann before Jerusalem. That's the title of the book, Bettina Stagnet. And she killed me. She destroyed me in this huge page. I don't know, something like a feature in the New Yorker. I just read the first paragraph and the last paragraph. And this could have been impossible for a German historian, because also it's so touchy and for all of this. But I took the freedom. because I wanted to write the trajectory. And it's not only about Mengele, it's about the trajectory of Europe for me. For me, what did Mengele and what happened during these years is a metaphor of what happened in Europe. So I took this, like it's like a poet. It's weird to use the word poetic freedom, but somehow, I mean, Mengele, as I said before, was a conservative. I mean, his first wife, he married in 38, studied art history in Florence. I mean, you had these two European bourgeois, but that guy, a few years later, could send hundreds of thousands of people to the gas chambers whistling opera. This is exactly what happened in Europe. I mean, this trajectory is incredible. So I wanted to understand also the trajectory of after. So I took the freedom to write a novel. Plus, if I had written a biography, who would have read 700 pages about Mengele?
Right.
No, but it's serious. I mean, nothing will be stronger than testimonies. But the last witnesses are disappearing. So what's next? How do we tell this story? And the last thing, I didn't write this book for the memory. I mean, I'm happy that it contributes to this, but more as a warning. Because Mengele is a man without qualities. He's nothing special, he's very mediocre. He's just the opposite of this idea of the angel of death, like it's a Marvel name, the angel of death. He's just the opposite. He's a little guy. He's nothing without the regime, which protected him and authorized him to practice all what he did. He's nothing. He's a man without qualities. But when a man without qualities, and there are millions of people like him, opportunist people, meet a system like the one of the Nazis, this is where catastrophe starts, because they know exactly how to use little men like Mengele. And I wrote the book in 2016. And I think that was the worst year in the history of France after the war. I mean, we had Charlie Hebdo, we had Le Bataclan, we had Nice at that time. And this idea of evil was in the air again. And we all feel it somehow. Of course, it's not, I don't make any comparison, but there was something in the air. There has been something in the air the last 10 years at least. So this is more a kind of a warning, what can happen. Than the very idea of to cultivate this memory. Because when you're a teenager today, I mean, when you speak about the Second World War, I mean, okay, it's important that the kids know who was Eichmann and Mengele and Heydrich and so on, but I think what is more important is to see how far a normal, an average, a mediocre human being can go within a very special system.
Well, I'm proof that it did all right, you know.
We survived.
Yeah, we survived, right. Do we have questions from the audience at all? Yes.
Thank you. You talked in the beginning about Mossad agents hunting Mengele as they did Eichmann. In reality, and also in your sort of historical fiction or creative nonfiction, how did Mengele relate to Israeli Jews who had power and were hunting him versus how Mengele related to the Jews in Auschwitz when he murdered them and operated on them?
Well, Mengele never had any relationship to the Israeli Jews, for sure. Nothing. We read this short passage, and the Mossad was after Mengele just for a few years. But we must never forget that the Mossad is not the secret agency of the Jews abroad or the memory of the Jews. It's the secret service of the State of Israel. So you have all this dimension of realpolitik. And Mengele also managed to escape because of the realpolitik of the time. Because Israel had other interests than just to catch old Nazis in South America. And of course, I explain why in the book, and I won't go into details now about this, but just one element, for instance, this realpolitik thing. The capture of Eichmann in Argentina provoked very strong reactions against Israel, because you don't play with sovereignty of state sovereignty. And Israel in the 60s needed at the UN Council all the voices which were available for Israel, which meant notably the voices of South American states. So you couldn't do twice or 3 times or 4 times what happened with Eichmann. You had to respect the sovereignty of Brazil, for instance. So this is one of the reasons. There are many others. But this is just a good example how it worked at the time.
There's maybe one note I would add to that. I mean, it was leaked. Maybe some of the documents were leaked, some of them were declassified not so long ago. That answered a very interesting question, which is, where is Eichmann's body? Where is he buried? And you ask anyone, and I don't know, he's dead. I don't know where he is. There were discussions at the highest level of the Israeli government. We don't want to bury him here. He doesn't deserve any part of this earth, and also we don't want it to become a pilgrimage shrine. They also didn't want to go and dump him in the water. So a man who was, it's arguable who he actually is, because the documents that came out have code names in them. Someone from the Mossad said, you know, I know where we can get plans for a crematorium. There was never a crematorium built in Israel at the time. Cremation is against Jewish law. And they went to at that time, a tent city in southern part of the country, in the Negev, and got I believe, Yemeni or Moroccan workers to come and work with an engineer who read the German plans, and they built a crematorium and cremated Eichmann, and then they disassembled the crematorium. Any questions? Thanks.
Your story is good when you want to leave a party.
Yeah.
You tell the story, and then you can go good night to everybody. It's a great one.
Right here. Yes?
Maybe with the microphone.
She was asking about Mengele's last days.
Well, it was that was the winter of '79. He was in Brazil. He was a very lonely man, and he drowned the 7th February of '79 on a beach in the Sao Paulo state. And he was very lonely. He lived in a kind of a favela. He was in love with this kind of nurse who took care of him, but he didn't dare to marry her, and he was extremely lonely.
Say he was thought to be living in a favela,
Yes.
but you also said that his family had a business in Brazil.
Yes. Sure. But, I mean, we spoke about the first part of his life in Argentina. In the book, it's called The Pasha. So that was the sweet life, when he worked for the family business all around. But after the capture of Eichmann, he was afraid. So he had to leave, to flee, to change his name again and again. And at the end of his life, after he spent these 12, 15 years with his Hungarian family, he moved to a favela in some dirty parts, the worst parts of Sao Paulo, where he lived alone. So this is the end of his life. This is how he lived at the end of his life. So very, very differently from the 50s in Buenos Aires. I mean, in Buenos Aires, he had a fantastic life. I mean, he arrived under the pseudonym of Helmut Gregor. But after a few years, he went to the German consulate and said, well, I'm sorry, I came under a false identity. I'd like to go back to my identity. So he became again Mengele. And if you would get the phone book of the 50s, of the late 50s, you would find a Josef Mengele in Buenos Aires. Yeah, this is something we didn't talk about. But in the 50s, they were not searched, these people. On the contrary, I mean, the survivors of the camps were seen as very suspects because they had survived. And the people who had survived, there were many questions about them. why did he survive and not my mother or my brother or my father and so on? What did he do? Did he cheat? Did he sleep? Did he betray? Did he pay? And so all these people, they never spoke, in fact, about what happened. And everybody was focused on the future. I mean, these were very young people at the time, in their 30s. And because notably of the Cold War, the Nazis were no research. So they had a very happy life, but also in Germany and in Argentina, and that was not the priority of the time. And Israel was not interested at the beginning. It's completely changed with Eichmann. But before Eichmann, all these people had a very quiet and a very nice life. I mean, this is our perspective. And one thing that I wanted to do with the book, with this narrative nonfiction, was to depict the atmosphere of the time. Not to write the story from our perspective, which is not interesting to understand the context of the time, but it's written at the present. It's not written at the past tense. So this is something which was very important. You follow the evolution, and you also follow the zeitgeist, the idea of the times. And in the 50s, it was a completely different idea of the 60s and 70s. But the Holocaust, in fact, became a central part of our identity in Western societies at the end of the 70s, not before. I mean, we have this, Germany made amazing things concerning this, the memory, but they started pretty late. I mean, the first commemoration of the Kristallnacht, the Night of Crystal, was in 78. That was not in 58 or 68. Why 78? Because basically all the actors of the Nazi time, more or less important, more or less busy with the Nazis. They were in the university world. They were the pillars of any society: university, police, politics, judicial system, and so on, business. After all these people went to pension, were retired, you could start, to dig really into this, because the societies were not in danger. And this is exactly what happened in France. I mean, we didn't speak about Vichy before the 70s. And in Italy, I don't know if it even happened, actually. In Austria, it was even later, in the 90s. But Germany and France, this is the late 70s. And in America, it also became a central part of the American identity in the late 70s also. And what played a crucial role is this series Holocaust with Meryl Streep. For instance, in Germany, this is what I talk about in my book about the history of the Jews in L'Impossible Retour. Holocaust was a huge shock in Germany, because suddenly this story was incarnated by the story of a family. There were historians, of course, who worked on this before. But at the end, that was the story of a family, very easy to understand. And with the possibility, in fact, to identify yourself with the fate of a family. And this is from that time that Germany completely changed its politics and its policy of its relationship to memories. And this is also what it's written like a novel, but so there are just a few paragraphs about this, but it's impossible to understand the life of Mengele and if he was searched or not without understanding this. And what is kind of terrible in this story that when Mengele dies in 79, he's buried under a false identity. So no one knows where he is. And people thought he was still in Paraguay, still alive. And from that time, so he dies in 79, exactly at the time when the Holocaust series is broadcast all around the world. So you have this huge wave. And from that time, everyone wants to catch Mengele at the end. The Israelis, the Americans, the West Germans, everyone. But he's dead. So the last part of the book, it's called The Ghost. They're looking for a ghost. I mean, he was dead. And then so it took something like 6 years by chance. And if you read the book, you will know how they ended up finding his body. They discovered that he was dead and he was buried under a false identity in Brazil. So this book is also about the evolution of the relationship of the Western societies to the Holocaust, and just the very idea of the Holocaust, which didn't exist in the 50s, for instance.
I mean, I'll add one thing to it, which has a deep South American and significantly French connection, which is that I remember reporting on this when it was brought to light. It was discovered a little bit earlier, but by the time I got to it, it was sort of brought to light again. Was Elie Wiesel, right, writes night, right, in Yiddish, and he publishes it serially in a Yiddish journal that turns up in South America, and it turns out that he tried to suppress it for a lot of his life because he tried to translate it and had no success, and he rewrote it again in French. And that's the version that we know. And comparing the Yiddish version and the French version is to understand really the shift in understanding the Holocaust. You know, in the Yiddish version, it is a young man who's full of rage, who just wants to murder everyone who murdered all of his people. It is like unrelenting, and it is expressionistic, and it's written with true venom. By the time he gets to writing it in French, you know, a language of humanism, it's softened, and it's for a general audience. He knows that he's not writing for the Yiddish press anymore.
Yeah, there are many examples like that, like the books of Raoul Hilberg, so the classic, the standard about the Holocaust studies. No one read it when it was published, I think, in 1960. It was, or the books which were published in the late 40s, early 50s. No one had interest in this kind of literature. Another example, someone I quote, because I go back at a certain point in the middle of the book about what Mengele did in Auschwitz, and I quote one of his assistants, an Hungarian doctor. This doctor managed to survive. I mean, it's nearly impossible to understand how he managed to survive, but he survived. And when he comes back to Hungary, so 45, 46, he writes a memoir. No one read that book at the time. No one had any interest in that book. People wanted to think about the future, of course. They wanted to bury this part of the terrible history. And basically, another motivation, when we think, when we envision all former Nazis, we have two kinds of images. We have the black and white of the 40s, young people in the camps or in Russia or wherever. And then we have some old people of the 80s and the 90s. But we don't have any images in between when these guys were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, in the 50s, in the 60s. When in fact, these people meet our modernity. And this is something which is, I mean, you have to imagine, I always thought about this when I watched documentaries about Woodstock when I was a teenager. I mean, Woodstock took place 24 years, only 24 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. I mean, it's amazing what happened in one generation. And a guy like Mengele was only 57, 58 when Woodstock took place. And in fact, the collusion of the two worlds, of the two systems, is something, there was not many things written about this encounter of this impossible encounter. And this is why also he's so lost in the 60s, in the 70s. He doesn't understand what happened exactly, just one generation. And this is our history, this is our modernity somehow. And we still live in that world in a certain way, especially in Europe.
Somewhere in there. One last question. Then you pick. I can't. That's too much pressure.
So you spoke sort of in the last question about how using fiction benefited you in terms of being able to explain the trajectory of Josef Mengele. I'm curious more about how, if you experience any tension in the research process of being able to create that trajectory sort of using fiction and the desire to know more, sort of from an investigative research sense, whereas like in the example you stated about the restaurant, if you could maybe find some source, say that actually which restaurant they did meet at, would that be more, like, how did you reconcile that tension between wanting to learn more and being able to tell that sort of story?
I didn't draw the trajectory. I respect the trajectory of Mengele. And for instance, at the end of the book, you have that's the second turning point of this history, then when he meets his son for the first time. So two worlds meet. The son born in 44, so this kind of new Western German, and the old Nazi, who was not so old at the time, 59, something like that, 60 anyway. So I don't draw the trajectory, I respect the trajectory. What I do, that sometimes I feel the voids, the little things. So the reader can, these are possibilities that I explore without mentioning that this is potential, I mean, a potentiality for fiction. But again, as I said before, I had a responsibility first with myself, otherwise I would have created a full fiction. And for the reader, of course, I mean, the person who reads this book, at the end of the book, knows what happened to Mengele in South America.
I should also just really interject for a second, that, and I probably didn't do a decent job of explaining it earlier, is that a lot of this book is about the making of fiction. It's about first of all, the suppression of truth. People are in denial, governments are in denial, and then the sensationalism that comes out, as Olivier was talking about Simon Wiesenthal, and this sort of depiction of Mengele as this great Bond victim, and you know, and of course all of the fictions about the Mossad, and it becomes this cinematic invention. And so part of the chronicling is also, it's a nonfiction chronicling of fictions.
It's a kind of the deconstruction of the fictions of the time about Mengele, using fiction techniques for a narrative nonfiction. Is it clear?
One more? No?
No. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
But Olivier and Joshua are available to sign books. Thank you.